So today we're going to be speaking about nature-related risks and opportunities and dependencies in the nature-related space and how this influences corporate decision-making within the South African context. So to understand this emerging nature narrative, we have to think about this in the broader context of ESG, environment, social and governance aspects, and obviously the whole thing around nature-related risks speaks specifically to the E in the ESG, the environmental topic. So for the past 30 years we've had this incredible and significant focus on climate change as part of the E in the ESG. And out of that development, obviously there's been a lot of reporting and corporate reporting requirements, and we've seen this actually accelerated over the past 5 to 10 years with significant effort in terms of trying to meet the IPCC targets with regards to carbon reduction and decarbonisation of portfolios and activities and industries across the world. And this is a common narrative which we're all very familiar with and aware with. So out of the disclosure environment around that, we've seen the development of CDP reporting, the Carbon Disclosure Protocol, which has been in place for numerous years, and many of the South African corporate entities are engaged in reporting your carbon footprint and carbon disclosure with regards to that. Similarly, following on to the CDP, we've seen the emergence of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has actually taken up a lot of the research and the reporting requirements within the CDP and is now seen as the mainstream disclosure framework to address climate-related risks and impacts. And potentially, as the TCFD framework matures, is to look at scenarios within that and then building resilience in your organizations in terms of meeting those certain scenarios. And we've seen those different climate scenarios, the 1.5 degree scenario, 2 degree, 3 degree scenarios, etc. So it's relatively well entrenched in science and supported by science-based targets. However, the nature discussion around it has been significantly lacking. And what we have seen through the COVID-19 pandemic is that it provided a 2-year interregnum where really post-COVID we've seen this emergence of the nature-related narrative emerge very strongly. I think part of this, how this connects to the finance system, has been quite interesting, specifically as the World Economic Forum in 2020 in their Nature Risk Rising report estimated that the global GDP exposure, which is highly material and material exposure to nature-related risks, relates to about $44 trillion US. So quite a significant amount that is exposed through the nature narrative. On the back of the NGFS, the WEF work, we've seen the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, from a central banking perspective, produce numerous country reports in response to this initial report by the WEF. The first bank to do that was the Dutch Central Bank, where they looked at their investment and exposure, etc., and highlighted one of the top ecosystem services, that of pollination, and quantified that risk in terms of the Dutch financial system. Flowing onto the Dutch financial system, we saw the Banque de France do a very similar report, and then numerous other reports that have come out post that. Mexico, Malaysia, some of the most recent has been Hungary to do that. The NGFS has similarly brought out a compendium report about 2022, which consolidated all of these different reports, the approaches and the methodologies used, and what does this mean for the finance system going forward. And I think this has been a fundamental amount of work and a seminal piece of work, as there's a plethora of current disclosure frameworks, and how does that support the nature narrative going forward and vice versa. Some of these disclosure frameworks that we're well aware of that have been entrenched in South African reporting environment, such as the Global Reporting Initiative, the Biodiversity Standards, etc. The latest one has just been out for release, I think it's 304, really speaks to the whole issue about integrating nature or nature-related or environmental risks into business processes. On the back of that, we've seen quite a significant development globally through the ISSB and supported by the IFRS. We've seen the S2 sustainability standard coming out, as well as S1 sustainability standard, and then the S2 climate-related disclosures. So these are being developed. We see a convergence and an interoperability between the different standards on a global level. And there's always this talk, how is this going to influence the South African finance system? So there is this global move, specifically through EFRAG and the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, which has been issued by EFRAG in the adoption of specifically sustainability standards in corporate reporting. So we see this moving from a voluntary space into a mandatory space, which has got a significant impact on the way that South Africa corporates are going to be reporting into the future. So we can anticipate, on the back of the EU directives, that South African corporates will, over time, depending on what our regulatory and supervisory guidance framework looks like locally, have to start reporting in terms of these requirements. Specifically, if we're trading into the EU, there's going to be barriers to entry to trade, and we need to take these into consideration. So, September 2023, we saw the release of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures framework, specifically focused on nature, and that was developed on the back of the TCFD framework. So there's interoperability between the TCFD as well as the TNFD. What makes the TNFD a lot more complicated and potentially a lot more interesting is that on the back of that, they have the LEAP process: locate, evaluate, assess and prepare, which is really focused around the nature narrative. And the whole concept behind that is to understand what your operations, where your operations located, and what are your operations impacts on the environment and the environmental impacts of the environment on your operations, as well as looking at the dependency, which is quite a critical differentiator when we're talking about this disclosure environment in terms of your operations dependencies on the natural capital, the ecosystem services, which nature provides largely for free. And we're seeing that a really strong uptake, specifically in the global finance sector, with regards to the TNFD process, and there's already speak from the finance regulator in Switzerland in terms of adopting it and ensuring that it becomes a mandatory requirement, with at least in Switzerland at this point, but we can be assured that over time it will be adopted by the rest of the EU jurisdictions going forward. And this will have implications on South African reporting and disclosure requirements as well. We're currently seeing activity from our central bank and prudential authority in considering climate-related financial disclosures. So there is draft supervisory guidance out at the moment for comment around that, as well as climate stress testing, which is going to be conducted during the course of this year, 2024. So there is definitely a move towards a place where they are going to be requiring, at least initially, the finance sector to consider this in their reporting and disclosures, and potentially moving from a voluntary, which is currently the case, into a mandatory space going forward. And we're anticipating that this will be the same for the nature-related financial disclosure ecosystem and environment as well. So in time, you can expect that this will become a draft supervisory guidance, possibly within the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years. And this would need to be considered by corporates going forward, how you would respond to that. Notwithstanding the fact, we've seen a numerous amount of international corporates become early adopters of the TNFD framework, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, as it provides them value in terms of understanding what their organizations, operations, where they're located, and like I said earlier, what those impacts are, but specifically what is that activity's dependency on nature. So I would actually encourage South African listed entities as a minimum to consider adopting the TNFD framework and becoming either early adopters or start with that disclosure process and ensuring that over time that you do meet those requirements. We usually say rather sooner than later, and really the very couple of first steps in the right direction would have significant benefit to your corporate bottom line ultimately. So as an early adopter, you'd need to connect your nature-related risks, exposures and dependencies to what your bottom line is in terms of your balance sheet and corporate financial reporting going forward. I hope this has been insightful, and please do reach out to SAICA if you have any questions around nature-related risks, dependencies, and specifically the adoption of the TNFD framework.